In a city where appearances are often mistaken for worth, one man walked quietly into a luxury store, searching for nothing more than a good suit. But what happened next would expose the arrogance of power, the blindness of prejudice, and the strength of calm dignity. This is not just a story about a man in a store. It is about the cost of judging too quickly, the humiliation of being underestimated, and the shocking moment when hidden power steps into the light. Stay with the story until the end, because the truth waiting at the final moment will leave you breathless. It was a late afternoon in the city, the kind of day where the sidewalks glimmered with a golden haze, and people moved in hurried streams carrying shopping bags and coffee cups. Inside Lexington Plaza, the most exclusive shopping center in town, the marble floors reflected the lights of luxury stores, and the quiet hum of wealth floated in the air. Into this world stepped Darius Moore. He moved with a calm, unhurried confidence, dressed in a charcoal-gray jacket over a black turtleneck. There was nothing flashy about him, nothing loud. He didn't wear jewelry or carry shopping bags that screamed wealth. Yet there was something in his quiet presence, an authority that couldn't be explained but could be felt. He stopped in front of a glass storefront. Behind the glass, mannequins were dressed in finely tailored suits that shimmered with understated elegance. Darius's eyes lingered on a deep navy suit, simple yet refined. With a small nod to himself, he pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. The soft notes of classical music greeted him, along with the scent of polished leather and imported cologne. Chandeliers hung above, casting a golden glow over the racks of clothing. Behind the counter, a young sales associate noticed Darius and quickly straightened up. He was barely 22, eager and nervous, the kind of employee who wanted to prove himself. "Good afternoon, sir," the associate said with a polite smile. "Can I help you find something today?" Darius returned the smile, his voice steady and warm. "Yes, I'd like to see some of your navy suits. Something subtle but well made." The young man nodded eagerly and motioned toward the racks. "Of course, sir. Right this way." But before Darius could take more than a few steps into the store, the atmosphere shifted. Heavy footsteps approached, and from the corner emerged a man in a press security uniform. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his expression carried the weight of suspicion. His name was Frank Doyle, the head security guard of the plaza, and he prided himself on knowing who belonged and who didn't. Frank's eyes scanned Darius from head to toe, and in that instant, a judgment was made. He saw a black man standing in a luxury store without the flash of wealth he was accustomed to. In Frank's mind, Darius didn't fit. He didn't belong. "Hey!" Frank said sharply, his voice cutting through the soft music. "Can I help you with something?" Darius turned slowly, meeting the guard's cold stare. "Yes," he answered calmly. "I was just speaking with him, looking at some suits." He gestured lightly toward the young associate. Frank didn't even glance at the associate. His eyes stayed fixed on Darius. "Right. Thing is, this store's not really the place to hang around. You get me?" The words landed with the weight of an insult. The young associate shifted uncomfortably, glancing between the two men, but his nervousness kept him silent. Darius's posture didn't change. His voice remained even. "I assure you I'm here to purchase, not to hang around." Frank's lips curled into a thin smile, one without warmth. "Sure you are." The young associate tried to step in. "Sir, he was just asking about." But Frank silenced him with a raised hand. His eyes narrowed on Darius, his tone sharpening. "I'll handle this." And in that moment, the quiet shopping trip Darius had planned began to spiral into something else entirely. Frank Doyle stood tall, blocking the soft glow of the chandeliers, as though his very presence dimmed the room. The security guard crossed his arms, his badge glinting faintly on his chest. To him, Darius was not a customer. He was a problem that needed to be removed before it could cause trouble. Darius kept a composure, but there was a tension in the air that even the young associate could feel. Eli shifted on his feet, his hand fidgeting with the hem of his blazer. His instincts told him this wasn't right, but his fear of overstepping his boss's authority kept him frozen. Frank's voice dropped lower, quieter, but heavier. "Look, I don't want to cause a scene, but people come in here sometimes just to loiter, sometimes worse. I've been doing this long enough to know the type." The words hit harder than a shout. The type? Darius looked at him, his eyes steady. And what type would that be? Frank smirked, tilting his head as though the answer were obvious. The type that doesn't buy anything. The type that doesn't belong in stores like this. The insult lingered, thick and sour. Eli swallowed hard, his voice finally trembling out. Sir, with all due respect, he asked about the new Navy collection. He seemed serious. Frank cut him off, his tone sharp. I said I'll handle it. He turned back to Darius, his jaw tightening. Now, I'm asking you nicely. Step outside. For a long moment, Darius didn't move. The music playing softly in the background seemed to echo louder, the piano keys falling like droplets of water in a cavern of silence. Customers browsing near the back of the store were beginning to notice. Their glances were quick, unsure, but curiosity always draws eyes when tension grows thick. Darius finally spoke, his tone calm, almost disarmingly so. Are you asking me to leave because you believe I can't afford to be here? Frank chuckled under his breath, shaking his head. Let's not play games. You're wasting your time. And mine. Eli's chest tightened. His training had taught him that every customer deserved respect. But here he stood, powerless against a guard whose authority outweighed his. He opened his mouth once more. Mr. Doyle, I really think we should. Enough, Frank snapped. The word cracked through the air like a whip, silencing Eli completely. Darius slowly looked around. Other shoppers were now staring openly, whispering behind their hands, their expressions ranging from pity to quiet judgment. He inhaled deeply, letting the weight of the moment settle before answering. I came here to shop, he said firmly, but if you prefer to make a spectacle of me, I can walk out. Frank's eyes gleamed with strange satisfaction, as if victory was within reach. He stepped closer, his voice dripping with finality. Yes, that's exactly what I want. Walk out. Now. The silence that followed was unbearable. Eli's throat tightened. His heart raced. He wanted to scream at his superior that this was wrong, that this man had done nothing to deserve such treatment. But fear of losing his job tied his voice down. Darius studied Frank's face for a long moment. His eyes were not angry. They were calm, controlled, almost disappointed. Without another word, he turned and began walking toward the door. His footsteps echoed against the marble, each one carrying a weight of dignity that the guard's arrogance could not diminish. As he reached the door, Frank called out one last line, loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. That's what I thought. Don't come back unless you can actually afford something. The words sliced through the silence. Eli's stomach twisted with shame, though it wasn't his insult to bear. Darius paused at the door. He placed his hand against the glass, pushed it open slowly, and stepped outside. The bell chimed gently, almost mockingly, as if announcing his humiliation to the world. The young associate's eyes followed him through the glass, something gnawing at his conscience. Something told him that the guard had just made a mistake far greater than he realized. And indeed he had, for the man who had just been thrown out of the store was not only capable of buying a suit, he was capable of buying the entire company. But for now, he walked away silently, his dignity intact, leaving behind whispers, stares, and one arrogant security guard who believed he had won. Outside Lexington Plaza, the evening air was cooler. The golden light of the sun stretched across the glass towers, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. Darius stepped out slowly, his face calm, his stride unbroken. Onlookers outside had no idea what had just happened inside the store. To them, he was just another man leaving a luxury shop. But for Darius, every step carried weight. He had been judged not by his words, not by his intentions, but by a glance, by assumptions, by the arrogance of a man who believed his uniform gave him a right to decide who belonged and who didn't. He paused near a bench outside the store. A woman with shopping bags walked past, sparing him the faintest glance, then looking away as though the sight of him standing there was somehow out of place. Darius noticed. He always noticed. Yet he said nothing. Inside the store, Frank Doyle stood tall, chest puffed out with pride. To him, he had done his job. He believed he had protected the store's image, kept away a loiterer. He didn't notice Eli's clenched jaw, the way the young associate stood frozen in shame. Eli finally spoke, his voice quiet but firm enough to be heard. "That wasn't right, Mr. Doyle." Frank turned his head, narrowing his eyes. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Eli said, his throat tight but his conviction growing. "He was a customer. He wanted to buy something. You didn't even give him a chance." Frank chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Kid, you got a lot to learn. Men like that don't come in here to buy. They come in to waste time, to make a scene, sometimes worse. I saved you time and spared this store embarrassment." Eli's fists curled at his sides. "The only embarrassment was how you treated him." Frank's expression hardened. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Listen to me. If you want to keep this job, you'll keep your mouth shut and do as you're told. You don't know how the world works yet. I do. And trust me, I can spot trouble from a mile away." Eli's chest rose and fell with frustration. He wanted to fight back, but his fear of losing his position chained him down. He turned away, biting his lip, his mind heavy with unease. Meanwhile, outside, Darius finally began walking again. He strolled past storefronts, his eyes scanning the plaza with quiet thought. He did not storm off. He did not rant. He did not let anger twist his expression. Instead, he walked as if every step was a calculation, every breath a reminder that patience was a weapon far sharper than rage. As he rounded the corner of the plaza, a voice called out to him, "Sir? Excuse me, sir." It was Eli. The young associate had rushed out, his tie slightly askew, his breath short from the sprint. He looked nervous but determined. I'm so sorry about what happened in there," Eli said, his voice trembling. "That wasn't right. You didn't deserve that." Darius studied him, his eyes soft but unreadable. "It wasn't your doing." "No, but I should have spoken up sooner," Eli confessed. "You asked about the Navy collection. I know you were serious. I wanted to help you, but he shut me down." Darius gave a faint smile, one that carried more weight than words. "You tried. That matters." Eli shook his head, frustrated. "It doesn't feel like enough. People like him. They think they can just decide who belongs. It makes me sick." Darius's gaze lifted toward the glass storefront. He watched Frank pacing inside, the guard's chest still puffed out like a man who believed he had restored order. After a long silence, Darius turned back to Eli. "Tell me," he asked quietly, "what's your name?" Eli Turner." "Eli," Darius repeated softly, as though committing it to memory. "Thank you for your honesty. Hold on to it. You'll need it in this line of work." Eli frowned slightly, puzzled by the weight of the words. Will you come back? I mean to finish shopping." Darius's eyes glimmered with something unspoken. "Yes, I'll be back. Sooner than they think." With that, he walked away, his figure blending into the crowd outside the plaza. Eli stood frozen, a chill running down his spine. He didn't know why, but he felt certain that he hadn't just spoken to an ordinary man. Back inside, Frank muttered to himself, adjusting his uniform. "Another day, another clown thinking he belongs in here. Not on my watch." He had no idea that the man he had just thrown out would soon return, not as a customer, but as the very power behind the store's future. And when that moment came, everything Frank believed about authority, respect, and belonging would collapse. That night, the plaza glittered with lights. Stores were closing, but offices across the city skyline still hummed with life. In a corner office on the top floor of a glass tower just 2 blocks away, the atmosphere was very different from the humiliation Darius had endured earlier. The office belonged to More Capital Holdings, one of the most powerful private investment firms in the country. From the outside, no one would know that the man they had dismissed as a loiterer was in fact the mind behind the empire that owned half the real estate on that very street. Inside the boardroom, sleek mahogany tables stretched across a room lined with floor-to-ceiling windows. A team of executives sat in silence as Darius entered, his jacket draped neatly over his arm. He walked with the same quiet confidence he had carried into the store earlier, but here in this space, his presence was instantly commanding. No one questioned whether he belonged. The chief financial officer rose to his feet. "Mr. Moore," he said with respect, We finalized the acquisition paperwork for Alston and Reeves. The signing is scheduled for next week. Darius lowered himself into the head chair at the table. His fingers tapped softly on the polished wood, his face calm, thoughtful. "Good," he said quietly, "but we'll need to move faster. Their culture is flawed, and what I witnessed today only confirms that." The room shifted, curiosity sparking in the eyes of the executives. No one dared ask what he meant, but the weight of his words hung heavy. Darius's mind replayed the scene. Frank's cold stare, Eli's timid defiance, the whispers of shoppers watching a man stripped of dignity in a space meant for service. He could still hear Frank's voice echoing, "Don't come back unless you can actually afford something." A bitter irony. Darius exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry. Anger would have been too easy, too small for what was at stake. Instead, he was calculating. Every insult carried an opportunity to teach. Every humiliation carried the seed of reform. "Prepare the staff at Alston and Reeves' headquarters," he finally said. "I'll be visiting in person. Quietly at first. I want to see the truth from the ground up, not the polished version they'll try to show me." The executives nodded. They had seen this before. Darius Moore never rushed to punish. He observed. He studied. And when the time came, his moves were devastatingly precise. Far across town, Frank Doyle sat in the dim security office of Lexington Plaza, his feet propped on a desk, sipping from a paper cup of coffee. He bragged to another guard about his earlier triumph. "Had to throw some guy out today," Frank said, his tone dripping with arrogance. "Thought he could waltz in, act like he was going to buy something. You should have seen him. Try to play calm, like he was better than me. I shut that down quick." The other guard chuckled, shaking his head. "Yeah, you're always on top of it, Frank. Nothing gets past you." Frank smirked, leaning back with pride. "Damn right. These stores trust me to keep the wrong kind out. I know how to read people." But as he sipped his coffee, he had no idea that the man he mocked was even now setting in motion a chain of events that would soon shake his world apart. Meanwhile, Eli sat in his small apartment, staring at the ceiling, unable to sleep. The image of Darius walking out the store played over and over in his mind. He kept hearing Frank's voice. "Don't come back unless you can actually afford something." He whispered into the quiet room, as though confessing to himself. He didn't deserve that. Something about the way Darius had spoken, the steadiness in his eyes, haunted him. Eli didn't know who the man really was, but he knew, deep in his bones, that he was important. More important than Frank could ever understand. Back in the tower office, Darius stood by the window, looking down at the city. The plaza lights glittered in the distance, tiny jewels in the night. His reflection stared back at him in the glass. A man underestimated, humiliated, but never broken. He spoke softly, almost to himself. Tomorrow, the tide begins to turn. And as the city slept, wheels were already spinning. Wheels that would soon expose the arrogance of one man, the weakness of a corrupt culture, and the quiet, unstoppable power of a man who carried dignity like a crown. The next morning dawned crisp and clear. Lexington Plaza bustled with life again, its marble floors gleaming as cleaners polished every surface to perfection. The store opened promptly at 10, the staff straightening racks of suits and adjusting displays under the soft golden light. Frank Doyle was already at his post. His chest was puffed out with the same arrogance he carried the night before, his eyes sweeping the plaza like a self-appointed gatekeeper of wealth. He sipped his coffee slowly, scanning every shopper who walked past, searching for someone who didn't fit. Inside the store, Eli adjusted a mannequin's collar with slow, distracted movements. His mind was elsewhere. He hadn't slept well. The memory of Darius being forced out still gnawed at him. The look in a man's eyes, calm, steady, but with something deeper hidden beneath, had left a mark. Eli didn't know why, but he felt as though the moment wasn't finished, as though the story wasn't over. And he was right. By late afternoon, whispers spread through the plaza. A high-level corporate meeting was scheduled to take place in the building's main conference hall. Executives in dark suits arrived one by one, carrying leather briefcases and murmuring among themselves. Something big was happening, though most didn't know exactly what. Eli glanced nervously out the store window as the crowd of important men and women grew. His stomach twisted when he saw him. Darius Moore, walking calmly into the plaza, his stride deliberate, his presence commanding in a way that now seemed undeniable. He was no longer just a quiet shopper browsing suits. Heads turned as he passed. Conversations hushed. People moved out his way without even realizing why. There was something about him that commanded respect without a single word. Frank, however, stiffened. His eyes narrowed. He muttered under his breath, "You've got to be kidding me." He stepped forward, blocking Darius's path, his voice sharp. "Didn't I tell you not to come back here?" Shoppers nearby froze, glancing between them. Eli's heart raced. He wanted to intervene, but his throat tightened. Darius stopped. Slowly, he turned to face Frank. His expression was calm, almost patient, but his silence carried more power than 1,000 shouted words. Frank sneered, lowering his voice but not his arrogance. "You think you can just stroll back in here after yesterday?" "What?" You didn't get the message. A ripple of tension spread among the onlookers. Eli stepped forward, unable to stay quiet any longer. "Mr. Doyle, please." But before he could finish, the sound of polished shoes echoed across the marble floor. Executives in suits approached quickly, their faces alight with urgency. One of them, a tall man with silver hair and a commanding presence, stepped directly toward Darius. His voice rang with respect. "Mr. Moore, welcome. We've been waiting for you. The board is assembled upstairs." The words hit the plaza like a thunderclap. Shoppers gasped. Eli's eyes widened in shock. And Frank froze in place, his face draining of color. For a moment, silence reigned. Darius looked at the executive, then turned his calm gaze back to Frank. His voice was soft, but it carried the weight of a verdict. "You told me not to come back unless I could afford something. Tell me, Frank, do you think I can afford this?" The silver-haired executive gestured respectfully toward the elevator. "Sir, the acquisition papers are ready. Once you sign, Alston and Reeves will be officially under your control." The crowd erupted into whispers. Eli's knees nearly gave out. The quiet man he had tried to defend was the new owner, the billionaire CEO whose name had been whispered in financial circles, the man whose company had been acquiring luxury brands for years. Was the very same man Frank had humiliated? Frank stumbled back a step, his voice faltering. "Wait, you're the new?" Darius didn't need to answer. His silence was enough. The executives flanked him respectfully, guiding him toward the elevators. Shoppers parted like waves in front of him. Every eye in the plaza was locked on him, admiration, awe, and shame flickering across their faces. Frank stood frozen, his arrogance crumbling in real time. He had thrown out the man who now owned not just a store, but the very building he stood in. And for the first time in years, Frank Doyle felt small. Darius paused at the elevator doors. He turned back just once, his voice calm, deliberate. "Power doesn't always announce itself, Frank. Sometimes it walks quietly, and the way you treat people when you think they're powerless reveals everything about who you are." The doors opened with a soft chime. Darius stepped inside, the executives following close behind. As the doors slid shut, Frank's reflection lingered in the glass. Pale, shaken, and exposed. The tide had turned, and Frank Doyle's downfall had just begun. The news spread like fire across Lexington Plaza. By evening, whispers had turned into full conversations, and conversations into headlines. Customers who had witnessed the scene told their friends. Store clerks called their families. Within hours, everyone knew the story. The quiet black shopper humiliated at the door was none other than Darius Moore, the billionaire CEO who had just taken ownership of Alston and Reeves. Inside the store, Eli tried to keep working, but his hands trembled as he folded shirts. Every customer who came in seemed to glance at him differently now, some curious, some sympathetic. He was the only one who had tried to speak up the night before, and though he had done little, people noticed. Frank, however, wasn't so fortunate. He sat stiffly on a leather chair in the back office, beads of sweat running down his temple. His manager stood across from him, holding a printed memo from headquarters. Her lips were pressed into a thin line as she read aloud. Effective immediately, Frank Doyle is placed on indefinite suspension pending further review. An internal investigation will determine whether termination is warranted, but given recent events, she trailed off, her eyes locking on him with something close to disgust. Frank clenched his fists. It was a mistake. I didn't know who he was. Her voice was sharp. That's the problem, Frank. You shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect. He had no answer. His usual bravado, his swagger, gone. The silence of the room pressed down on him until he felt smaller than he had ever been. Meanwhile, upstairs in the sleek boardroom, Darius sat at the head of a long mahogany table. The city skyline stretched wide behind him, the sun casting golden light across the room. Executives lined the table, their pens poised, their voices cautious. But Darius wasn't interested in profit margins or acquisition figures. Not tonight. He leaned forward, his voice steady, resonant. I don't tolerate arrogance masquerading as authority. I don't tolerate people using their positions to humiliate others. This isn't just about one man at a door. It's about culture. It's about the message we send to every single customer who walks into our stores. The room was silent. No one dared to interrupt. Darius's eyes scanned the faces before him. I built my career on excellence, yes, but more than that, on dignity. If Alston and Reeves is to continue under my leadership, every employee must understand. Respect is not negotiable. Not for wealth. Not for race. Not for anything. Eli, summoned quietly into the boardroom, sat at the far end of the table. He had never been in a meeting like this before, surrounded by suits worth more than his yearly salary. He shifted nervously in his chair until Darius's eyes softened as they met his. You spoke up, Darius said simply. Not loudly, not perfectly, but you tried. That matters. Eli swallowed hard, unsure what to say. His voice cracked. I just didn't feel right. What happened to you? Darius gave a small nod. That instinct is what we need in this company. Integrity when no one is watching. Courage even when your voice shakes. The executive scribbled notes, some exchanging uneasy glances. For the first time, Eli realized he wasn't just in the presence of wealth. He was in the presence of leadership. Downstairs, Frank walked out of the store with his security badge removed, his posture hunched. The very same shoppers he had once eyed suspiciously now looked at him with disdain. Some shook their heads. Others whispered. For once, the stares weren't directed at Darius. They were directed at him. By the time Frank reached the revolving doors, he felt stripped of everything. The uniform that had once made him feel powerful now seemed like a costume. His footsteps echoed against a marble floor, lonely, final. The world he had tried to control was moving on without him, and upstairs, Darius was reshaping it. The following morning, the city woke up to headlines. Every major paper carried the same story. Security guard throws out black shopper, then finds out he's a billionaire CEO. The photo of Darius leaving the store the night before, shoulders squared, expression calm, walking with quiet dignity, had gone viral. It wasn't the face of a man humiliated. It was the face of a man who refused to be broken. Commentators debated the incident on morning shows. Some tried to defend Frank, calling it a misunderstanding. Others cut through the excuses with searing clarity. This isn't about mistaken identity. One anchor said sharply, it's about assumptions. It's about how people are treated based on the color of their skin before they ever open their mouths. At Alston and Reeves' headquarters, Darius stood before an auditorium packed with employees. Hundreds of faces looked back at him, ranging from anxious to inspired. Every department had been called to attend: sales, design, logistics, even store-level associates. Cameras were set up to stream the address live to locations across the country. Darius didn't use a script. He stood alone, one hand resting lightly on the podium, his voice low and steady. 2 nights ago, he began, I walked into one of our stores. I was there to shop. That's all. But before I could take 10 steps, I was told I didn't belong, that I was wasting time, that I wasn't welcome. A murmur moved through the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats. I didn't push back, Darius continued. I didn't shout. I didn't need to, because the truth is bigger than one confrontation. This isn't about me as a man. This is about the culture we create. The question isn't, what if the man you threw out happens to be the CEO? The question is, why would you throw anyone out without dignity? The silence was heavy, almost sacred. Even those watching online leaned closer to their screens. He let the words hang for a moment before continuing. I grew up in a world where doors closed in my face, where assumptions followed me before I even spoke. I worked twice as hard for half the recognition, and I promised myself that if I ever reached a position of influence, I would never forget those moments. I would never forget what it felt like to be unseen. His gaze swept across the crowd. So here's my promise. Alston and Reeves will not be a company that looks away. We will not tolerate disrespect masquerading as procedure. Starting today, every employee, from the sales floor to the executive office, will undergo intensive training, not just in customer service, but in empathy, not just in protocol, but in humanity. We will create a culture where respect is the baseline, not the reward. Applause rippled through the auditorium. It wasn't polite applause. It was fierce, emotional. Some employees stood, clapping harder than they ever had in their lives. Eli, seated near the front, felt tears prick his eyes. He had never heard words like these from someone in power. And then Darius did something unexpected. He motioned for Eli to stand. The young man froze, his stomach twisting with nerves, but finally rose. "This," Darius said, his hand gesturing toward him, "is Eli. He's one of the associates who saw what happened that night. He didn't have the authority to stop it, but he had the courage to speak. And that matters. Integrity matters." The spotlight burned hot on Eli's cheeks as hundreds of eyes turned toward him. He stammered, I just thought it was wrong." Darius smiled softly. "And that thought is exactly what I want everyone here to carry with them. The instinct to treat people with fairness, even when it costs you." The applause swelled again, louder this time. Eli sat down quickly, his heart pounding, but he knew his life had changed in that moment. While the company was rebuilding, Frank was unraveling. Back in his small apartment, he sat at his kitchen table, scrolling through news articles on his phone. Every headline seemed to scream at him. His name wasn't mentioned, but he knew people would find out. His neighbors already looked at him differently. His friends stopped answering his calls. Even his own brother had texted, "Man, what were you thinking?" Frank slammed the phone down and buried his face in his hands. For years, he had strutted through life, certain that the uniform made him important, that authority meant respect. But in one night, he realized it had only made him small. The respect he thought he carried had never belonged to him. It had been borrowed, fragile, conditional, and now it was gone. For the first time in years, Frank felt powerless, and he didn't know how to live with that. Meanwhile, across the city, Darius prepared for the next step. The boardroom speech had been for employees. The auditorium address had been for the company. But the message he was about to give, that was for the world. The press conference was scheduled for Friday. Every major network planned to cover it live. Cameramen adjusted their tripods, journalists scribbled notes, and the room buzzed with anticipation. Darius walked to the podium, his presence commanding the space without effort. He didn't look like a billionaire trying to control a narrative. He looked like a man who had lived through something heavy and was determined to turn it into change. He looked directly into the cameras, speaking not just to those in the room, but to the millions watching at home. "This isn't a story about wealth," he said plainly. "It's a story about worth. And worth is not measured by skin color, clothing, or assumptions. Worth is not decided by the man at the door. It is carried within every human being who walks through it." The cameras clicked. The lights flashed, but Darius's voice remained steady. "What happened to me was wrong. But what happens to countless others every day? People without money, without influence, without a platform. That is the real injustice. If this moment shines a light, let it shine wide enough to see them too." By the time he finished, the room erupted into questions, flashes, applause. But Darius simply stepped away from the podium, his expression calm. The point had been made. The world had heard. The press conference lit a spark. By the time evening fell, that spark had become a wildfire. Clips of Darius's speech flooded every platform. On social media, hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag worth not wealth. Hashtag justice in plain clothes. Hashtag we belong. People began sharing their own stories of being profiled, dismissed, or judged before they had a chance to speak. Some were heartbreaking. Some were furious. All were undeniable. One video showed a young black woman in tears, recounting how she'd been followed in a clothing store the week before. Another post told of an elderly man mistaken for a trespasser when he was simply watering plants outside his apartment. The comments poured in. I've lived this. I've felt this. I've carried this silence. The world was no longer silent. News anchors replayed Darius's words on a loop, dissecting every sentence. Editorials called it one of the most powerful corporate addresses in a generation. Universities discussed it in ethics classes. Churches quoted it in sermons. For once, a corporate scandal wasn't brushed under the rug. It had become a turning point. But for Frank, the aftershocks were unbearable. His suspension had been made official pending termination. Word spread quickly among security firms, and job offers evaporated before he could even apply. Neighbors whispered when he walked by. Children pointed. His name had become a cautionary tale, though it was never printed in full. At night, he sat alone, drinking cheap whiskey and staring at the ceiling. The silence pressed in like a punishment. He thought of the moment he had grabbed Darius's arm, the smug certainty he'd carried when he barked. Out! Now! It echoed in his head, mocking him. Frank realized something bitter. For years, he had built his sense of worth by making other people small. He thought power meant pushing others down. Now that illusion had crumbled, and he was left with nothing. Meanwhile, Eli's world was turning upside down in the best way possible. The day after Darius's address, he was called into the regional office. His palms were sweaty, his nerves tangled, convinced he might be in trouble for speaking up. But instead, a senior director shook his hand and said, Darius wanted us to make this official. You've been promoted to assistant floor manager. Eli blinked, stunned. Me? Yes, you earned it. You showed courage when others stayed quiet. That's the kind of leadership we need. For the first time, Eli felt the weight of being seen. Really seen. It wasn't about a paycheck or a title, though both mattered. It was about knowing that speaking up, even in fear, had changed something. At home, Eli's mother cried when he told her the news. I always told you, son, she whispered, hugging him tightly. God sees the truth, and sooner or later, the world does too. In the weeks that followed, reforms rolled out across Alston and Reeves. Training programs were launched nationwide. Anonymous reporting hotlines were set up. Store signage carried a new slogan beneath the brand's logo, respect. Always, employees who once kept their heads down began speaking more boldly, calling out unfair practices, knowing they had support from the very top. But beyond the company, the ripple spread. Other businesses began reviewing their own policies. Some issued public commitments to equity. Others faced pressure to change. Activists seized the moment, organizing town halls and workshops. Darius, though, kept a low profile. He turned down interviews that wanted to sensationalize the story. He didn't want to be the billionaire who went viral. He wanted to be the man who shifted a culture. His focus stayed on the work, the reforms, the people. Yet in private moments, late at night in his penthouse overlooking the city, he allowed himself quiet reflection. He thought of his younger self, the boy who had been stopped in a department store at 16, accused of stealing headphones he had saved up to buy. The shame, the helplessness, the anger he swallowed. He thought of his mother's voice, telling him not to fight, not to give them reason. And he thought of that night in his own store, how the cycle had threatened to repeat. But this time, he had turned it into something else, something bigger. Frank, however, couldn't escape the cycle. One evening, weeks after the press storm had quieted, he sat in a dim bar nursing a drink. A group of men at the next table were laughing, scrolling through their phones. He caught a glimpse of the screen. It was Darius at the press conference. The caption read, A billionaire in plain clothes. A lesson in dignity. Frank clenched his fists around the glass. The laughter wasn't directed at him, but it might as well have been. He stood abruptly, slamming a few crumpled bills on the counter, and walked out into the night air. The city was buzzing around him, full of light and noise, but Frank had never felt darker or more invisible. The fall from power hadn't just taken his job. It had stripped him of his armor. And without that armor, he didn't know who he was. The aftershocks were uneven, like earthquakes rolling through different lives in different ways. For Darius, they brought change and responsibility. For Eli, they brought hope and opportunity. For Frank, they brought reckoning and ruin. And for the world watching, they brought a question too important to ignore. How many times must dignity be denied before it is defended? The weeks stretched into months. But for Frank, each day felt heavier than the last. He had once walked through store aisles with the swagger of authority, keys jangling at his belt, uniform crisp, eyes scanning for threats he imagined only he could detect. But now, the uniform was gone, the authority stripped away. His savings dwindled, job applications went unanswered, and whispers followed him wherever he went. It was as if the world had branded him, not with ink on his skin, but with shame etched into his name. One night, desperate for work, he stood outside a warehouse, waiting with a line of other men for casual labor. The supervisor walked down the row, picking workers at random. When he reached Frank, he paused, squinting. "Weren't you the guard from the Alston store? The one in that viral video?" Frank's throat tightened. He muttered, "No, that's not me." But the man smirked, unconvinced. "We don't want trouble. Move along." The line shifted. Frank stood frozen, humiliation rising like bile. When he finally turned away, shoulders hunched, he realized this was a reckoning he had never imagined, being treated as disposable, as unworthy, as invisible, exactly how he had treated others. Meanwhile, Eli's promotion was both a blessing and a trial. As assistant floor manager, he now oversaw a staff he once stood beside as an equal. Some resented the change, muttering that he had only been promoted because of the incident. Others looked to him with hope, expecting miracles he wasn't sure he could deliver. One afternoon, Eli caught a sales associate eyeing a young black teenager with suspicion. The associate whispered to another, "Keep an eye on him. Looks sketchy." Eli's chest tightened. The moment felt eerily familiar, a shadow of a night when Frank had judged Darius. He stepped forward calmly but firmly. "Is there a reason you're assuming he's a problem? Or is it just because of how he looks?" The associate flushed, stammering, No, I didn't mean." "Then serve him like you would anyone else," Eli said, his voice steady. "Here, respect isn't optional. It's policy." The teenager glanced up, catching Eli's eye. For a brief moment, gratitude passed silently between them. It was small, but it mattered. At home that evening, Eli collapsed on the couch, exhausted. His mother brought him tea and sat quietly beside him. "You're carrying a heavy mantle, son," she said softly. "But remember, leadership isn't about being perfect. It's about standing firm when it matters most." Her words steadied him. He realized a promotion wasn't just a title. It was a calling. And then there was Darius. The reforms were working, but slowly. He knew systemic change was never quick. Each day brought new reports, new resistance, new challenges. Some shareholders grumbled about the cost of training. A few even suggested the controversy had distracted from profits. Darius sat at the head of the boardroom table, listening to their complaints. His expression was calm, but inside, the storm brewed. One board member leaned forward, hands steepled. "With all due respect, Darius, don't you think we've gone far enough? Public memory fades. Why keep pouring resources into this?" The room went still. Darius leaned forward, his voice low but sharp. "Public memory fades," he repeated. "But people's dignity doesn't. And if you think this company exists only to squeeze profit from the pockets of those we disrespect, then you don't understand why it exists at all." His gaze swept across the room, pinning each executive in place. "I built this company from the ground up," he continued, "not so we could be the richest, but so we could be the best, the most just, the most human. If that makes you uncomfortable, you're free to resign." The silence was absolute. No one moved. No one spoke. Later that night, in the solitude of his office, Darius reflected on the weight of leadership. Power wasn't just about authority. It was about responsibility. And responsibility was heavier than any billion-dollar decision he had ever made. Meanwhile, Frank's reckoning reached its breaking point. On a cold evening, he wandered the city streets, pockets empty, heart heavy. He stopped in front of an Alston and Reeves store, staring through the glass at the warm glow inside. Shoppers moved freely, smiling, laughing, welcomed. He saw Eli now in a manager's blazer, speaking kindly to a family. He saw staff working with respect, not fear. The store was thriving without him, better without him. Frank pressed a hand to the glass, his reflection staring back at him, hollow-eyed and broken. He whispered to himself, "That should have been me." But deep down, he knew it never could have been, because true authority came not from power, but from humility, and that was something he had never learned. The reckoning was complete. The world had moved forward, and Frank, left behind, faced a bitter truth. Change had come, with or without him. The boardroom was silent, but outside those glass walls the world was speaking loudly. Protesters had gathered in front of Alston and Reeves' headquarters, holding signs that demanded fairness, accountability, and change. Reporters swarmed the sidewalks. News vans lined the block. Inside, Darius Moore stood at the head of the long oak table, his presence commanding yet calm. He had summoned every senior executive, every department head, and representatives from every store. This was not just a meeting. It was Judgment Day. The weight of expectation filled the room. Eli sat a few seats down, his blazer crisp, his posture upright, but his hands nervously clenched in his lap. He wasn't the young sales associate anymore. He was a manager now, carrying the voice of those who worked under him. Darius spoke, his voice low and resonant. "We are not here to bury this company. We are here to rebuild it. But we cannot rebuild on rotting foundations. What happened in that store, what Frank did, was not just one man's mistake. It was a symptom, a reflection of blind spots, of arrogance, of prejudice that too many of you ignored because it was convenient." His words struck like hammer blows. Some executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Darius continued, "The world is watching us. And more importantly, our employees are watching us. Our customers are watching us. They want to know if this company is what it claims to be, a place where everyone belongs." He paused, scanning the room. "So here is what will happen." The room seemed to hold its breath. Every employee, from security guard to senior vice president, will undergo training that does not just teach procedure, but humanity. Bias will be addressed, not excused. Systems of accountability will be implemented at every level. Promotions will no longer be decided in smoke-filled rooms, but through transparent reviews that measure character as much as sales. And our board will open its doors to voices that reflect the diversity of the people we serve. Murmurs rippled. Some nodded. Some frowned. But Darius's voice cut through again. "If you think this is too much, if you think we're going too far, let me be clear. You may leave your seat now. But know this. The future will not wait for you. And neither will I." The silence was absolute. No one rose. From the far end of the table, Eli felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he didn't feel like he was simply in the room. He felt like he belonged there. Darius turned toward him. "Eli, you've seen this company from the floor up. Tell us what needs to change." Eli's throat tightened. He swallowed, glanced around the table at faces far older and richer than his own, and then spoke. "Respect," he said simply. His voice wavered at first, then steadied. "Respect needs to be the foundation. I've seen too many good workers overlooked because of where they came from or how they look. I've seen customers treated as if their money was worth less than someone else's. That ends today. If this company truly values people, then it has to start with respecting every single one who walks through our doors." The room went still again. Some executives looked startled, as if they had expected a timid response. But Darius smiled faintly, proud. "You've said what needed to be said," Darius replied. and it will be written into the DNA of this company. As the meeting adjourned, reporters outside shouted questions. Darius stepped out into the flash of cameras, his words prepared, his spirit unshaken. "To those who doubt," he said, his voice echoing off the marble walls of the building, "understand this. Justice is not a distraction. It is the mission. Profit without justice is corruption, and we will not stand on corruption." The crowd erupted in cheers. Meanwhile, Frank sat in a dingy apartment, watching the live broadcast on a small flickering television. His hair was unkempt, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot. He leaned forward, staring at Darius's face on the screen. "That should have been me," he muttered bitterly, the words breaking in his throat. But deep down he knew the truth. It could never have been him, because he had never chosen respect. He had chosen arrogance. He had chosen prejudice. And now, he had nothing left but the echo of what could have been. As Darius's words rang out across the nation, Frank lowered his head into his hands. For the first time, not in anger, but in despair. That night, the footage played on every major network. Social media flooded with praise, debate, and reflection. For some, Darius was a hero. For others, he was a reminder of how much work still needed to be done. But for all, he was proof that dignity could not be silenced. Inside his office, long after the cameras were gone, Darius sat alone. He stared out at the city skyline, lights flickering against the night sky. He thought of his mother's words when he was young. "One day, they'll try to tell you who you are. Don't let them. You tell them who you are. Every time." And he had. He whispered softly into the night, "This isn't the end. It's the beginning." The next morning, the sun rose over the city in a blaze of orange and gold, but the air felt different, softer, charged. It was as though the speech Darius Moore delivered the day before had cracked something open, not just in a company, but in a nation, across the country. Newspapers carried his words on their front pages. Justice is not a distraction. It is the mission. That single line echoed from breakfast tables to classrooms, from coffee shops to subway cars. In one small town, a teacher stood before her students, holding up the article from her tablet. She read it aloud, her voice steady. "Profit without justice is corruption, and we will not stand on corruption." Then she lowered the screen and said, "This is what leadership looks like." In a crowded barbershop, men debated the meaning of Darius's words. Some argued it was just another speech, destined to fade into the noise. Others swore it was different, that this time something had shifted. One young boy in the corner, waiting for his haircut, whispered to himself, "I want to be like him when I grow up." Meanwhile, at Alston and Reeves stores across the nation, something new was happening. Employees were speaking up. Sales associates who had once kept their heads down began voicing concerns. Managers who had ignored the quiet whispers of injustice now found themselves forced to listen. At one store in Atlanta, a customer noticed that the security guard who used to follow him around now greeted him with a polite nod instead. It wasn't much, but it was a start. The company's PR department had prepared endless press releases, but none of them were necessary. Darius's speech had already become the press release. Eli, adjusting to his new role, found himself interviewed by a local news crew. The camera light blinked red as a reporter asked, "What do you think has changed since the incident?" Eli paused, the weight of the moment pressing on him. Then he said, "What's changed? We've stopped pretending. People like me, people who come from the bottom, we don't have to be silent anymore. If you work hard, if you show respect, you deserve the same in return. No exceptions." The clip spread across social media, racking up millions of views. Messages poured into his inbox from strangers thanking him for speaking up. For once, Eli didn't feel like just an employee caught in the gears of a massive corporation. He felt like a voice. But not everyone celebrated. Behind closed doors, some of the old guard, executives who had grown rich off complacency, grumbled. "This is going too far," one muttered during a private dinner. "This isn't about business anymore. It's politics." Another shook his head. "It's survival. The public's behind him. If we don't move with him, we're done." Their words revealed the truth. Resistance was still there, lurking. But it was weaker now. chipped away by the undeniable tide of change. And Frank? Frank watched it all unravel from the shadows. His name had become infamous, a cautionary tale of arrogance and prejudice. He couldn't walk into a store without catching whispers. He couldn't apply for a job without the same question coming up, "Aren't you that guy?" One evening, desperate for work, he walked into a warehouse with a "Help Wanted" sign. The manager looked at him, frowned, then shook his head. "Sorry, we don't need that kind of trouble here." Frank stormed out, rage boiling in his chest. But when he caught sight of his reflection in a shop window, he froze. The man staring back wasn't the confident guard he once was. It was someone hollowed out, carrying the weight of every choice he'd made. He punched the glass with his fist, but it didn't crack. Instead, it was his knuckles that split open, bleeding down his wrist. He staggered back, staring at the red dripping from his skin, realizing for the first time that some wounds never heal. Back at headquarters, Darius wasn't celebrating. He was planning. Late into the night, he met with advisors, drafting reforms that went deeper than policies and procedures. He wanted scholarships for underprivileged youth. He wanted mentorship programs pairing young workers with seasoned leaders. He wanted community investment, not just corporate expansion. "This isn't just about us," he said, circling words on the whiteboard. "It's about proving that a company can lead without losing its soul." His team looked exhausted, but inspired. One of them asked, "Do you really think this will change the world?" Darius leaned back, his gaze steady. "No, not the world, but it will change our world. And maybe, just maybe, that's how the bigger world changes too." The following week, a special issue of Forbes featured Darius on the cover, the headline blazing across the glossy page. "The CEO who said no to silence." The article praised his courage, but more importantly, it documented the tangible changes already happening. Employee satisfaction rising, customers returning, communities rallying, and woven into the piece was Eli's story. The young man who had found his voice, mentored by a leader who saw in him what he once saw in himself. For Eli, life would never be the same. His family back home watched him on television, tears welling in their eyes. "That's our boy," his mother whispered. "He made it." Eli didn't feel like he had made it yet, but for the first time, he believed he could. As the world continued to watch, the legacy of one humiliating incident grew into something no one could have predicted. The city was quieter now. The headlines had cooled, the protests had thinned, and the cameras had moved on to the next storm. But inside the walls of Alston and Reeves, the change was only beginning. Darius sat in his office one evening, the blinds half drawn against a fading light. The room carried a silence that was not empty, but full, the silence of decisions made and consequences unfolding. On his desk lay a stack of reports. New diversity programs being rolled out, revised contracts for suppliers, disciplinary reviews of managers. They were only papers, but to Darius, they were the bones of something larger, the skeleton of a company that might finally grow into what it claimed to be. A knock sounded on his door. It was Eli, still in his work clothes, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened, exhaustion written on his face. But behind that exhaustion was a flicker of pride. "Mr. Moore," Eli began, but Darius raised a hand gently. "Eli, after all this, you can drop the formality." Eli smiled faintly. "All right, Darius, I just wanted to say thank you, not just for giving me a voice that day, but for listening. I've been here long enough to know that's not something people at my level get." Darius studied him for a moment, seeing the weight in his young eyes. "You've earned more than just a voice, Eli. You've earned a place in shaping where this company goes. Don't forget that." For a moment, the two sat in silence, the city lights flickering between them. Eli's voice grew softer. "Do you think it'll stick? The changes, I mean, or will it just fade once the headlines die?" Darius leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "Change doesn't stick on its own. It sticks when people fight for it, every day, even when no one's watching. That's the challenge now, not to survive the storm, but to keep the ground we gained after it passed." Eli nodded slowly. The words sank into him like roots finding soil. That night, When Eli walked out of headquarters, the air was cool and the streets were calmer than they had been in weeks. Yet something stirred inside him. He realized he wasn't just clocking out a shift anymore. He was part of something larger. Meanwhile, Darius stayed behind. He turned his chair toward the window and let his eyes rest on the city that stretched endlessly into the horizon. He thought of the young man he had once been, walking into rooms where he was dismissed, doubted, or silenced. Now here he was, not just in the room, but at the head of it. And yet, power was not what he carried most heavily. Responsibility was. The night deepened, and the world outside carried on as always. Cars rushed past. Neon signs flickered. Laughter drifted from the sidewalks. Life went on. But in one corner office, a man sat alone, determined that the story they had all witnessed would not end as just another viral moment. It had to become something more. Because the real battle wasn't what had already happened. The real battle was everything still to come. Weeks passed. What happened at Alston and Reeves should have been a corporate scandal that faded after a news cycle, swallowed by the next outrage. But it didn't. It lingered. The video of Frank grabbing Darius by the arm and shoving him out of the store had become something larger than a clip of humiliation. It was now a symbol. Students were watching it in classrooms. Activists were holding it up at rallies. Politicians were citing it in speeches about systemic discrimination. Everywhere, people were talking about the man in the gray suit. What astonished many wasn't just that the man had turned out to be a billionaire CEO. It was the way he had carried himself. Calm, patient, never raising his voice, even when pushed to the ground. In a world trained to respond to violence with violence, his composure had pierced through. Darius hadn't sought the spotlight. In fact, he avoided interviews. When reporters camped outside his office, he would slip out the back door. When networks begged for sit-down specials, he politely declined. But the silence only added to the intrigue. And his one public appearance, that speech at Howard University, had gone viral beyond imagination. Clips of him saying, "I didn't fight back that day because I knew where I came from," were now stitched into TikToks, Instagram Reels, even protest chants. Young people across the country quoted him. His restraint had become a rallying cry. Meanwhile, inside the company, ripple effects shook every level. Some managers whispered resentfully in break rooms, calling the reforms overcorrections. Others, quietly relieved, admitted they had waited years for someone to finally hold the old guard accountable. Younger employees like Eli walked taller in the hallways, no longer invisible. But outside the glass towers, the story took on a life of its own. In a small town in Georgia, a young black boy stood up in his civics class and told his teacher, "I want to be like the man who didn't fight back." In Chicago, a group of college students organized a forum on racial profiling, using the incident as their centerpiece. In South Africa, a journalist wrote an op-ed titled "To Calm Billionaire," what America's quiet revolution teaches us. Even in boardrooms of rival corporations, executives whispered, "What if one of our security guards makes the same mistake? What if one of our CEOs ends up humiliated like that?" Policies began to shift, not out of moral awakening, but out of fear. Frank, meanwhile, lived the opposite ripple. His name, once unknown, had become infamous. The clip of his sneer, his shove, his words, "You don't belong here," had been memed, mocked, dissected, and condemned. He couldn't walk into a grocery store without someone muttering under their breath. Job interviews ended the moment HR searched his name. His arrogance had been captured forever, and the world had stamped him as the face of prejudice. At night, he lay awake, replaying the moment again and again. The look on Darius's face haunted him most, not anger, not fear, but calm. A calm that had made him, Frank, look smaller than he'd ever felt in his life. But while Frank sank, Eli rose. His quiet courage during the board confrontation had reached ears he never expected. A mentorship program was created under Darius's direction, and Eli was its first leader. For the first time in his life, he felt not just like an employee, but like someone shaping the future. The story had become a mirror. Some saw in the ugliness of their prejudice. Others saw the dignity they aspired to. But everyone saw something. And in that way, Darius had already won. It was late evening when Darius stepped out of the conference center. The city had quieted. The skyscrapers glowed with tired office lights, and the air carried the hum of traffic far below. His speech that day had ended hours ago, yet a heaviness lingered in his chest. As his driver pulled the car to the curb, Darius noticed a figure across the street. A man, shoulders hunched, hands jammed into the pockets of a worn jacket. For a moment, Darius thought nothing of it, until the man raised his head. It was Frank. Time seemed to fold in on itself. Memories of that day in the furniture store rushed back. The shove, the sneer, the humiliation. But Frank looked different now. His arrogance was gone, his posture defeated. He hesitated before crossing the street, as if unsure he deserved to. The driver moved to step out, but Darius lifted a hand. "It's all right." Frank approached slowly, his eyes avoiding direct contact, his voice raw from silence. "I didn't come here to cause a scene." Darius said nothing. He waited. Frank swallowed hard. "I lost everything. My job, my reputation. My own family barely speaks to me. Every time I walk outside, someone recognizes me. They whisper. They laugh. They know me as that guy, the one who threw out a man who didn't deserve it." His words tumbled out, desperate, almost childlike. I don't sleep anymore. I can't escape it. And I know I did this to myself. I know I did it to you. But I need," he faltered. "I don't know what I need. Maybe forgiveness. Maybe just for you to hear me." Silence stretched between them. The city moved around them. Cars rushing by, a bus groaning down the avenue, a siren in the distance. Yet here, the world seemed suspended. Darius studied him, not with anger, not with pity, simply with the weight of a man who had carried more than Frank could imagine. Finally, Darius spoke, his tone even calm, cutting through the noise. "When you shoved me that day, you thought you were putting me in my place. But the truth is, you only revealed your own. You showed the world the smallness of your vision, the ugliness of your assumption. That moment didn't define me, Frank. It defined you." Frank's throat tightened. His eyes shone, though he fought to hold back tears. "I know, and I can't undo it." "No," Darius said quietly. "You can't, but you can decide who you are from this point on. That's the only power you have left." Frank's shoulders slumped. "How?" "Everyone hates me." "Then start by not hating yourself," Darius replied. "Do the work. Look at the man in the mirror and ask why you needed to feel bigger by making another man small. Until you answer that, nothing else changes." Frank finally met his gaze. For the first time, his eyes weren't hard or defensive. They were broken. And in that brokenness, perhaps, was the beginning of something real. Darius turned toward the car. He placed a hand on the door handle, then paused. Without looking back, he said, "I don't carry you with me, Frank. Don't give yourself that power. My life is bigger than your mistake." The words landed heavier than any punishment, yet lighter than any blow. They were not condemnation, but truth. Darius stepped into the car, and the door closed. The vehicle pulled away, leaving Frank standing alone on the sidewalk, the city lights washing over him like judgment. He had sought forgiveness, but what he had received was something different, something deeper, a challenge. And whether he rose to it or not, that was now his story to write. Months had passed since that day outside the conference hall, and the ripples of the incident were still moving outward, reshaping institutions, altering lives. The headlines had long faded from the front page, but the impact had not. Inside the towering headquarters of Moore Capital, the atmosphere was different now. Employees moved with a quiet pride, knowing they worked for a company that had turned a moment of injustice into a catalyst for reform. Diversity initiatives were no longer buzzwords on glossy brochures. They were living, breathing realities. Scholarships had been established. Partnerships with community organizations flourished. Policies were rewritten not in response to pressure, but from conviction. Darius sat at the head of a long conference table, surrounded by executives, board members, and representatives from advocacy groups. His calm presence filled the room, though he did not speak immediately. He let the voices around him discuss progress, setbacks, ideas for the future. He listened, the way he always had, with patience that commanded respect. Finally, when the room quieted, he leaned forward. "What we are building here," he began, "cannot simply be about optics. It cannot be reduced to slogans or statements. It has to live in the everyday actions of every person who carries our name into the world. Justice is not a press release. Fairness is not a quarterly goal. These things are lived, or they're not real at all." There was a hush, not the silence of obligation, but of understanding. After the meeting, as the executives dispersed, Darius remained seated by the tall glass windows, gazing out at the city. He thought of Frank, not with anger, but with a lingering question. Would the man rise? Would he confront himself in the mirror as challenged? Or would he stay buried in the ruin of his own choices? Darius would never know, and perhaps he didn't need to. That evening, he stood once again before an audience. This time, it was at a university filled with young men and women who carried notebooks and wide eyes, hungry for truth. His speech was not scripted. It flowed from the well of experience carved deep within him. "I want to tell you something I wish someone had told me when I was your age," he said, his voice steady, resonant. "There will be people who underestimate you, people who mistake your silence for weakness, your humility for insignificance, your very presence for a problem to be solved. They will try to box you in with their narrow vision of who you can be. When that happens, remember this: their vision is not your truth. Their blindness is not your burden." The students leaned forward, hanging on every word. "I stood in a store one afternoon, treated like a trespasser in a world I helped build, and I stayed calm, not because I lacked power, but because I understood something deeper. True power is not loud. True power is not about domination. It is about control, not of others, but of yourself. The ability to decide who you will be, even in the face of cruelty." His words lingered heavy and electric. "And when you rise," he continued, his tone softening, "rise not only for yourself, rise for those who will come after you. Change does not happen in one speech, one headline, or even one policy. Change is a baton, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. Carry it, pass it, and never let it fall." The applause that followed was not the roaring kind that erupts in noise and fades in seconds. It was a wave, steady, rising, sustained, as though the audience needed more time to breathe in the gravity of his words. Later that night, as Darius walked to the quiet campus, he allowed himself a rare smile. The journey had been painful, yes, humiliating even, but it had led to something greater, not just for him, but for others. Out of injustice had grown a legacy of change. And somewhere in the city, perhaps in a small apartment lit by a single lamp, Frank sat alone, replaying their last conversation, wrestling with the man in the mirror. In the mirror, his story was unfinished, but it no longer belonged to Darius. The world moved forward, and Darius, calm, resolute, unshaken, carried with him not bitterness, but purpose. The story did not end in humiliation. It ended in transformation, not just for one man, but for many,